5 women, 5 short hikes, 5 disappearances. One hiker slipped toward rising water, another disappeared into a wall of fog. These are the stories of women who set out alone on trails they knew by heart and never returned. On August 12, 2015, steady rain fell across the Hoh rainforest in Olympic National Park. The temperature stayed cool throughout the morning, and thin fog gathered between the tall trees. The Hoh River Trail was damp but passable, with the usual mix of day hikers and backpackers moving through at their own pace. Most visitors stayed on the marked path because side routes were slick from recent rainfall. That morning, 39-year-old Kara Howell, a part-time librarian from Tacoma, started a solo hike on the lower section of the trail. Friends later described how she usually used her quiet days to walk alone on short forest routes. She wasn't an overnight backpacker and didn't carry heavy gear. Her pack held basic items: a light jacket, water, a paper map, and an older phone that struggled to get a signal in the forest. Kara planned to walk a simple out-and-back section of the Hoh River Trail, a route she chose because it was straightforward and didn't require advanced navigation skills. Rain had been falling since early morning, leaving the ground soft and the wooden footbridges slick. Fog drifted in and out of the tree line, especially in shaded areas near the river. At 11:20 a.m., a pair of hikers heading back toward the parking area passed her near mile 5. They later told rangers she was standing on the trail, checking her map and adjusting the straps on her pack. She gave a small nod as they passed. Nothing seemed unusual about her pace or her direction. Around noon, several hikers farther up the trail reported hearing a short call from somewhere behind them. Because the area often echoed with voices from other groups, many assumed it was normal trail noise and kept walking. At that time, no one suspected it was a call for help. Later evidence showed that somewhere after mile 5, Kara stepped off the main path and moved onto a narrow side track known locally as a fisherman's path. These small routes often lead down toward the riverbank and can be hard to navigate when wet. The steady rain had made the soil slick, and the moss-covered rocks along the edge were unstable. Tracks found the next day indicated Kara attempted to climb a short embankment that connected the narrow path back toward the main trail. The slope was only a few feet high, but the mud showed clear slide marks where her boots lost traction. Rangers noted that the rain had turned the surface into a thin layer of grease-like mud. Downstream, a man fishing from a gravel bar saw movement near the river's edge at roughly the same time. He did not know what he was seeing at first, but he later told investigators he saw a person wearing clothing similar to what Kara had been described as wearing slip and slide down the embankment toward the water. According to him, it happened quickly, in one motion, with no sign of the person trying to brace themselves or turn around. The river was running high that week due to recent snowmelt in the upper elevations. The current moved fast, carrying silt that made the water cloudy and difficult to see through. The fisherman saw the person enter the water and disappear almost immediately. He shouted for help, but there was no one close enough to hear him over the noise of the river. By the time he reached the spot, only disturbed mud and broken vegetation marked where the slide had occurred. The fisherman walked along the bank for several minutes, but the river's speed and the limited visibility made it impossible to track anything moving downstream. A trekking pole, later confirmed to be Kara's, was discovered the following afternoon. It had become wedged between a cluster of rocks a short distance from where the fisherman reported the fall. Search teams followed the shoreline and used small boats when conditions allowed, but rain and fog returned over the next 2 days. The low visibility slowed the effort. Despite multiple ground teams, dog units, and river checks, no further sign of Kara was found in the immediate area. The forest stayed misty through the week, and the river level rose again, carrying more debris than usual. Several weeks later, river maintenance workers clearing log jams several miles downstream found fabric fragments and part of a boot caught in a mass of branches. Rangers examined the items and confirmed they matched what Kara had been wearing that day. Based on the location and the known conditions, they determined her death was caused by a fall from the embankment, followed by swift water submersion in the Hoh River. The trail remained open, though signs were later added, reminding hikers not to follow unmaintained side paths during or after rain. Kara's route and timeline were reconstructed as accurately as possible, but the incident itself appeared to have lasted only seconds. Kara Howell's hike showed how a single step off a wet trail can change the entire outcome. But Kara wasn't the only hiker that year who faced sudden danger. Hundreds of miles away, another woman would walk into conditions that shifted even faster. On February 21, 2016, winter conditions across the White Mountains were shifting throughout the morning. Clouds moved low across the sky, and a thin layer of frost covered exposed rock faces along Franconia Ridge. The temperature stayed below freezing, and hikers heading toward the summits knew that winds would increase through the afternoon. Light snow from earlier in the week had frozen into patches of ice along narrow sections of the ridge. 27-year-old Emily Park, an office assistant from Rhode Island, arrived at the trailhead shortly after sunrise. She often did solo weekend hikes and usually chose well-marked routes. Her plan that day was to climb Little Haystack Mountain, cross a short portion of the ridge, and reach a lookout before descending. She carried winter gear, micro spikes, a printed map, water, and her phone, which only received a weak signal in higher areas. By early afternoon, the wind picked up noticeably. At 1:40 p.m., Emily reached a high point on the ridge and briefly called a family member. The call lasted just over a minute, with her updating them on her progress. The signal cut out mid-sentence as clouds moved across the ridge. That was the last confirmed communication she made. The narrow trail she intended to descend followed the ridgeline before dropping toward treeline. The path was steep in places, with sections of exposed rock and patches of ice from previous freeze-thaw cycles. The trail became more unstable as the wind increased and visibility dropped. What happened next was reconstructed months later from evidence found during snowmelt. Based on the location of her recovered gear, Emily likely began her descent soon after the phone call. Investigators determined she approached a narrow, icy section just below a rocky ledge. The footing there was unpredictable, loose rock on one side and a sharp drop on the other. At some point along that section, she lost her footing. Slide marks and disturbed snow patterns indicated she slipped on an icy patch and fell down a steep, rocky embankment. The drop was estimated to be 20 to 30 feet before leveling out onto a lower slope. With visibility reduced by clouds and no other hikers nearby at that hour, no one witnessed the fall. When Emily did not return home as scheduled, she was reported missing on February 22nd. Search teams arrived quickly, but fresh snowfall that week covered most surface clues. Helicopters, dog teams, and ridgetop crews scanned the area for several days, but strong winds and shifting clouds limited visibility. No trace of her or her gear was found before winter conditions worsened again. For months, storms continued to hit Franconia Ridge. Ice built up and then broke apart repeatedly, burying and uncovering sections of the slope. It wasn't until late May, during a period of thaw, that a group of backcountry runners noticed bright fabric partially visible beneath receding snow near a drainage below the ridge. Rangers arrived the same day and confirmed the items matched what Emily had been wearing. Over the next 48 hours, as more snow melted, additional gear was recovered along the slope. Her remains were found farther down the embankment, consistent with the fall path suggested by the disturbed terrain. Based on injuries, weather records, and trail conditions, officials concluded Emily Park died from an accidental fall after losing her footing on icy terrain during deteriorating weather. Franconia Ridge revealed how fast weather can erase a safe route, but in Virginia, it wasn't storms in the sky. It was damage left behind on the ground that set the next incident in motion. On May 7, 2017, the South District of Shenandoah National Park was still drying out from a storm that had moved through the night before. The ground was soft, small pools of water lined the trail edges, and several narrow paths showed signs of recent runoff. By mid-morning, the sky cleared and temperatures rose into the mid-60s, drawing day hikers onto the lower elevation routes. 32-year-old Hannah Rojas arrived at the Jones Run trailhead shortly before 10 a.m. She had recently joined a local hiking meetup group and volunteered to scout potential routes for an upcoming beginner outing. Jones Run was one of the trails she wanted to check that week. She wasn't rushing or trying to fit the walk into a tight schedule. She simply chose this morning because it was the first clear window after several days of work and rain. She carried only what she needed for a short inspection: water, a folded map, and a windbreaker tied around her waist. Her plan was to walk the lower section, note any muddy spots or blocked areas, and decide whether it was suitable for new hikers after the recent storm. At about 10:50 a.m., two older hikers heading downhill passed her. She appeared to be checking the next junction, and they continued on without noticing anything unusual. Not long after that point, the Jones Run Trail reached the split where a narrow connector branched off toward the main loop farther north. Spring growth partly covered the wooden post marking the intersection. A temporary warning sign about erosion had been placed there the previous evening, but by morning it had tipped sideways against low branches and was no longer positioned where someone approaching from Hannah's direction would clearly see it. Footprints found later showed that Hannah followed the connector. The route was visibly narrower than Jones Run, but the tread looked intact from the entrance. The first few hundred feet showed only minor erosion: soft sections of soil, a few puddles, and small runoff channels created by the overnight storm. As she continued, the connector began to angle along a hillside that had absorbed most of the storm's rainfall. Soil along certain edges had loosened and separated from the firmer ground above. Rangers later noted that from the trail surface, the compromised area appeared solid enough to walk on, especially in dim morning light. 15 minutes after hikers last saw her, a man traveling well below the slope heard a short, sharp sound from somewhere upslope, either a loose rock or a brief cry. He paused and listened, but nothing followed. In that part of the forest, falling branches and shifting debris after storms were common, so he resumed his walk. The next day, rangers inspecting the connector found the evidence of what had happened. A section of the slope had collapsed, leaving a narrow, uneven edge between the remaining trail and the steep drop into the drainage below. A single boot print sat directly on the weakened soil. Everything beneath that print had fallen away, taking the outer portion of the trail with it. Slide marks traced the short fall 6 to 8 feet before stopping on a muddy ledge. The ledge showed handprints in disturbed dirt, indicating Hannah briefly halted there, but the ledge itself had loosened during the storm. When she tried to shift her weight or stand, the remaining soil broke apart. From that point, the slope steepened sharply for about 20 feet. Scratched branches and torn vegetation showed the path of her slide, ending near a small stream channel where a broken sapling held a piece of blue fabric matching the color of her windbreaker. The location was hidden from most angles. Dense mountain laurel along the drainage blocked sightlines, and the slope shape directed sound downward rather than outward. Hikers passing on the main trail overhead would not have been able to see or hear much from below. Hannah Rojas never made it past the washed-out connector trail, but she wasn't the only hiker that season to step onto ground that failed without warning. In Alberta, another solo hiker encountered the same fate. On March 3, 2018, morning temperatures around Abraham Lake in Alberta hovered near freezing. Thin sheets of fog drifted above the North Saskatchewan River, and patches of ice along the shoreline showed cracks from the recent warm spell. The area was popular with early photographers who came to capture the morning light on the water. The trails nearby were mostly flat, but were known for unstable ice sections during late winter. 44-year-old Lydia Sorensen, a lab technician from Calgary, arrived shortly after sunrise. She often hiked alone on weekends and preferred easy riverside paths that didn't require climbing. She carried a camera bag, a small tripod, a thermos, and a basic day pack. She wore insulated boots, a winter coat, and gloves. According to a friend, she planned to walk a short section of the riverbank and return before mid-morning. At 7:15 a.m., two photographers setting up their equipment on a gravel bar saw Lydia walking along the edge of the river. They described her pace as steady, and she appeared to be looking for an open spot to take photos. The ice near the shoreline had a dull surface, showing it was thin, while sections farther from shore appeared thicker. The photographer said she stayed within 30 to 40 feet of the bank. Shortly after, the sun rose higher, reflecting off the ice and water. The temperature began to rise, though still below freezing. The river's flow remained strong under the ice, creating a hollow sound in some areas when stepped on. Cracks formed small lines that ran toward the bank, something common that time of year. By 7:40 a.m., the two photographers heard a sharp cracking sound. They turned and saw Lydia standing still on a patch of ice about 30 feet away. The ice beneath her feet sagged slightly. As she shifted her weight backward to step toward the gravel bar, a second, louder crack echoed across the river. Both witnesses later explained that the fracture occurred in a quick line extending outward from where she stood. The ice gave way in one piece, dropping her straight through. The opening widened as the broken edge collapsed under her movement. The water below was dark, fast, and extremely cold. River conditions that week included steady flow from upstream glaciers and meltwater. According to the witnesses, Lydia surfaced once near the edge of the break. She reached for the ice, but each time she touched the rim, it crumbled because the outer edges were soft and could not support weight. The witnesses moved toward the bank while calling for help, but the current pulled Lydia beneath the downstream shelf in only a few seconds. Once she moved under the ice, they lost sight of her completely. The river carried debris and slush, making it impossible to locate an opening downstream. The two men continued along the bank, yelling and scanning for any movement under the thin ice. They attempted to look for air pockets or breaks farther down, but conditions made it difficult to see through the cloudy surface. Wind began to pick up, creating small ripples across the exposed water patches. Search efforts began later that morning after another group of hikers encountered the two photographers and learned what had happened. They contacted local authorities once they reached a location with cell coverage. Rangers arrived and examined the scene. The ice around the break showed clear fracture lines pointing toward the river's center. Lydia's tripod was found lying near the gravel bar, partially covered in slush. The next day, crews using poles and ropes checked every accessible opening along the bank. By then, temperatures had shifted again, causing new cracks and making the ice too unstable to walk on safely. The river's current also changed each day due to fluctuating upstream melt, which moved debris unpredictably. Over the following weeks, melting ice gradually exposed portions of the shoreline that had been hidden earlier in the season. Flooded brush and low water pockets along the riverbend collected branches, small logs, and articles carried by the current. Search teams continued to sweep these areas as conditions allowed. In mid-April, during the first major breakup of the season, river workers clearing driftwood from a downstream bend noticed clothing tangled around a partially submerged log. Part of a boot was also lodged between branches nearby. They contacted rangers who confirmed the items matched what Lydia had been wearing on March 3rd. Based on the consistent evidence, witness accounts, the fracture pattern on the ice, river conditions, and the downstream recovery, officials concluded that Lydia died after falling through weakened shoreline ice and being pulled under by swift water. The stretch of river remained open to hikers, but updated advisories were placed at the trailhead, reminding visitors that thin ice near the bank can collapse even during cold weather. Seasonal warnings were also added to local park websites to reflect the hazard conditions typical in late winter. The break in the river ice showed how thin layers can fail without warning. However, the next case unfolded in an entirely different environment. The problem wasn't ice, it was heat, distance, and a desert trail that blended into the landscape. On October 2nd, 2016, early morning temperatures in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park started in the low 70s and climbed steadily with the rising sun. The air was dry, the winds were light, and visibility was clear across the open terrain. The park's washes and ridgelines cast long shadows that gradually pulled back as daylight strengthened. By mid-morning, heat began reflecting sharply off the pale desert floor. 29-year-old Marisa Keene, a substitute teacher from Escondido, arrived at the trailhead around 7:45 a.m. She often took short sunrise hikes before the hottest part of the day. She carried a small pack with a bottle of water, sunscreen, a basic map printed from the park's website, and her phone. She planned a simple 2-mile walk to a well-known overlook and then back the same way. The route was easy to follow under normal conditions. However, in early light, the main trail and 2 nearby washes looked similar from ground level. The washes were wide, sandy corridors shaped by seasonal runoff, and many visitors unfamiliar with the area mistook them for trail paths. At 8:20 a.m., a couple heading back toward the trailhead saw Marissa approaching the main junction. They exchanged a brief greeting. One of the hikers later said she asked if the overlook was just straight ahead. They told her to continue on the main path. The couple then continued toward the parking area, leaving Marissa to proceed alone. As the sun rose higher, shadows that separated the washes began to fade. Tracks found later showed Marissa followed the wrong wash shortly after the junction. The wash curved gently away from the actual trail, giving the impression of a stable route for the first quarter mile. By 9:30 a.m., the temperature climbed into the upper 80s. The wrong wash gradually narrowed, and its sandy bottom became uneven. A hiker about half a mile away heard what sounded like a faint call, but could not determine the direction because the sound echoed off surrounding ridges. The hiker paused, listened again, and heard nothing further, eventually assuming it was either wind or another group. The later investigation found that Marissa recognized at some point that she was off route and attempted to gain elevation for a better view. The slope she chose was made of loose gravel and scattered rock. Boot prints showed short steps upward, followed by slide marks where gravel shifted under her feet. From the top of the slope, the washes below looked nearly identical, offering little help for navigation. Tracks leading away from the slope indicated she descended on the opposite side, likely thinking she was reconnecting with the trail. Instead, she moved farther into an undeveloped area that branched toward multiple dead-end rock formations. By 10 a.m., temperatures reached the mid-90s. Heat waves distorted long-distance visibility, making ridgelines appear closer or farther than they were. Marissa's tracks formed overlapping loops, showing repeated attempts to orient herself. If she attempted to check her phone for navigation, no record remained due to lack of signal and battery condition unknown. A shaded section beneath a leaning rock showed signs she had rested. The sand there contained a partial imprint of her pack, but she appeared not to have stayed long. From that spot, her tracks moved toward a tall rock barrier that had no passable route on either side. Beyond that point, her footsteps became farther apart and less consistent. The ground grew more uneven with patches of hardpan and loose stone. A small mound of disturbed soil near a dry shrub suggested she stumbled but continued forward. No signs of intentional shelter building or backtracking were found. Search efforts began in the late afternoon after Marissa failed to return home. Her car remained parked at the trailhead with no additional clues inside. Initial ground searches covered the established trails, but the temperature made extended searching difficult. Night conditions brought cooler air, but visibility was limited, and the open desert made it easy to miss signs from a distance. Over the next 2 days, teams searched the washes, slopes, and ridgelines, expanding outward from the last confirmed sighting. Aerial units scanned for color contrast against the desert floor, but rock formations and brush created numerous blind spots. 2 weeks later, a survey team conducting mapping work near a cluster of boulders found clothing and gear partially buried in wind-blown sand. They notified rangers, who located Marissa's remains nearby in a shallow depression formed by runoff from past storms. Based on the environmental conditions and evidence at the scene, officials determined the cause of death was exposure after misnavigation into an undeveloped section of desert terrain. The park later added clearer markers at the junction where the washes diverged and updated visitor maps to highlight areas where trails blend with natural wash formations during early light. The overlook route remained open, but visitors were reminded to carry detailed maps and avoid leaving marked paths during rising temperatures. If you want to see more cases like these or deeper stories about real outdoor incidents, make sure to subscribe and check out the next video.